New York City is arguably the most powerful and important city on Earth. The city is split up into 5 sections, the most iconic being the island of Manhattan. But Manhattan isn't just an iconic island, it is actually the most valuable land on Earth. The value of Manhattan today is estimated to be over $1.5 trillion. For reference, there are only 15 countries in the world with a GDP over that amount. You would imagine that in order to obtain this land, settlers would have to fight some massive war with the Native Americans or give them something incredibly valuable in return. But what if I told you that the settlers were able to purchase the island of Manhattan for only $24? This purchase is known as the greatest trade of all time. But the truth is that this isn't the full story. So why exactly did the Native Americans make this trade, and how is the official story a complete lie? Well, you see, before it was the Big Apple, before Wall Street, Broadway, and Central Park, Manhattan was just a forested island covered in wildlife. In 1609, there was a company called the Dutch East India Company, and it was one of the most powerful and wealthy corporations on the entire planet. It had a monopoly on Dutch trade in Asia, and was essentially a global mega corporation with military power, fleets of ships, and its own overseas colonies. But the company had a big problem. They were doing a lot of trade in Asia, but traditional routes were long, costly, and extremely dangerous. Pirates, bad weather, and hostile rivers made the normal paths extremely risky. So the company decided to find a new, safer route to Asia. They hired an English explorer named Henry Hudson to sail into what we now call New York Harbor. Hudson's mission wasn't a casual voyage. He was tasked with finding a new route to Asia through North America. The demand in Europe for goods like pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg was enormous. If a shorter, safer path could be found, whoever controlled it would dominate global trade. The Dutch, who were already competing fiercely with the Portuguese and Spanish, saw this as their chance to leap ahead. Hudson's voyage was an investment with high expectations. But see, Hudson was not able to find a route to Asia through North America. His expedition confirmed what many explorers had already suspected, that no North American river led to Asia. Every river he explored, including the one now named after him, the Hudson River, turned out to be a dead end for ocean navigation. There was no magical waterway cutting through to the Pacific, and with winter approaching and resources dwindling, Hudson had no choice but to abandon the search. But during his retreat back to England, he took detailed notes on the surrounding geography, and one feature stood out above all the others: a large island with a wide, deep water harbor that led out to the Atlantic Ocean. The harbor was sheltered from rough waves and storms by natural landforms like Long Island and Staten Island. These geographic features acted like giant buffers, creating calmer waters and making it safer for ships to anchor and conduct trade. It was an ideal entry point into the continent, quiet, deep, and naturally defended, and perfectly positioned for overseas commerce. Hudson recognized the potential of this harbor immediately. Not only was it a safe place for European ships to go, but it was also positioned at the opening of a massive river system that stretched deep into the continent, meaning they could easily move goods in and out from deep inside North America. This discovery, although it failed its original mission, would become one of the most significant geographic finds in history. The only problem is that the Lenape tribe had lived there for thousands of years. They hunted, fished, and traded along the rivers and forests of the region, and they weren't willing to simply leave. The Dutch, however, blinded by dreams of wealth, were looking for ownership of the land. By 1624, the Dutch West India Company established New Netherland as a colony. They claimed land stretching from the southern tip of modern-day Delaware all the way up to present-day New York State. The heart of this colony, however, was a small, strategically positioned island that we now know as Manhattan. A year later, they placed a small fort and trading post at the southern tip of the island. The location was ideal for trading furs, especially beaver pelts, which were highly valuable back in Europe. Then came Peter Minuit, a representative of the Dutch West India Company who had a clear mission to legitimize and expand Dutch control, and to, above all else, make the colony profitable. His idea to achieve this was to strike a deal for Manhattan. So in 1626, Minuit offered the Lenape people a collection of goods. This included famously glass beads, iron kettles, axes, cloth, and other items valued at roughly 60 guilders, which was the Dutch currency at the time. time. To the Dutch, this was a legitimate transaction. In their legal framework, they had just purchased the land permanently. They documented it, backed it with state authority, and moved forward as if they had just acquired full, exclusive ownership of the Manhattan Island. But to the Lenape, it was a totally different story. See, they had never encountered the European notion of land ownership. They saw land as communal, meaning that no one truly owned it because it was for the people to share. So to them, the exchange had a very different meaning. It was seen as a symbolic offering, a gesture of peace and alliance, not a literal sale. So yes, from the understanding of the colonizers, they had just purchased the Manhattan Island for 60 guilders, or roughly $24 in today's money, while the Lenape thought that they were simply receiving a gift. But the story doesn't end there. See, this is where the real twist comes in, because some historians believe the Dutch may have brokered the deal with the wrong group entirely. The theory is that while the Dutch made the deal with the Lenape didn't even live on Manhattan Island. Instead, it was actually the Wekwaskik who lived on the island and never even met the Dutch. The belief is that the Lenape may have been visiting or trading nearby when the Dutch arrived and simply thought they were the native people. Since native groups did not view land as a commodity to be bought or sold, the Lenape may have accepted the goods without realizing they were transferring any sort of ownership, and especially not of land that they didn't even live on in the first place. So not only did both sides misunderstand the nature of the agreement, the Dutch weren't even speaking to the people that lived on the island they were purchasing. But despite the confusion, the Dutch considered the matter settled. With the land now under Dutch control, they began constructing a small town named New Amsterdam. They built a wall to protect the settlement from potential attacks, specifically from the north, where threats from rival tribes and other European powers lived. Over time, as the city grew and the wall was dismantled, the street that remained kept the name Wall Street. The Dutch promoted trade and allowed settlers from various parts of Europe to move in, making the colony relatively diverse for the time. Fur trade thrived and the port boomed. Manhattan was slowly becoming an economic giant. But the native tribes didn't just disappear. While some Native American groups attempted to maintain peaceful relations and trade with the settlers, tensions inevitably rose. The cultural misunderstanding about land ownership led to conflicts. As more Dutch settlers arrived and expanded into native territory, friction turned into violence. Fights broke out, and attacks from native tribes were common. What started as a trade rooted in confusion escalated into a series of bloody conflicts. One of the most infamous was Kieft's War, from 1643 to 1645, initiated by Dutch governor Willem Kieft, who authorized unprovoked attacks on local native villages. Hundreds of natives were killed, and the backlash was brutal. Tribes ended up uniting in resistance. The Dutch colonists lived in fear for years. Though eventually a fragile peace was restored, the damage was done and trust was broken. The native population declined rapidly due to disease, displacement, and war. So that may answer the question of how the Dutch purchased the land, but how did the US even get it? By the mid-1600s, the Dutch grip on the region began to weaken. A combination of internal mismanagement, poor relations with native tribes, and increasing pressure from rival European powers made it difficult for the Dutch to maintain control. Corruption and inefficiency plagued the Dutch colonial government. The Dutch West India Company was also struggling financially, so they took their focus away from the colony. Meanwhile, the English were rapidly expanding their presence along the Atlantic coast, growing stronger and stronger economies and militaries. The Dutch simply couldn't match the scale and ambition of the English colonial enterprise. In 1664, during a period of conflict between the two European powers, the British sent a fleet to New Amsterdam. Outnumbered and unprepared, the Dutch surrendered without firing a single shot. At the time, the Duke of York was the brother of King Charles II and a powerful political and military figure in England. He had been granted the territory by the king as part of a royal charter, which gave him claim over all the land from the Delaware River to the Connecticut River. The English renamed the city to honor the Duke of York, hence the name New York. From that point forward, the city's transformation accelerated. Under British rule, New York grew as a trading hub. It became a center of commerce, immigration, and military operations. And when the American Revolution began, New York was a strategic prize. Occupied by British forces for most of the Revolutionary War, it was one of the last cities they evacuated. Following American independence, New York grew even faster. By the 1800s, the grid system was laid out, Central Park was planned, skyscrapers began to rise, and the tiny $24 island became the financial capital of the world, worth over $1.5 trillion. All from a misunderstanding between the Dutch and the natives. The story of how Manhattan was bought for $24 is often told as a joke, the greatest bargain in history. It is also thought that the $24 number is completely wrong, but the true value of the goods they received doesn't really matter, because despite the amount of money, the natives would have never sold the island. Because how can you sell something that belongs to everyone? That's all I have for you guys. Click here to watch another video, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.